The South African Morning on eNCA. Now, here's something that you might or might not be struggling with this morning. We've heard of quiet quitting, but there is a new term, quietly cracking its way into the workplace, and it's called quiet cracking. It happens when employees feel stuck in their jobs while silently breaking under the weight of stress, burnout, and even panic attacks. Now, the pressure doesn't just hit workers, it chips away at productivity, engagement, and overall business performance as well. Unlike quiet quitting, which is a choice, quiet cracking is a silent collapse, and it's much harder for employers to detect it. Now, to discuss what this means for both staff and companies, we're joined by Leila Moosa from the Clifford Decker Hofmeyer's Employer Law Division. Good morning to you. Thank you very much for making time to speak to us here this morning. Now, like I've mentioned in the intro, we've heard of the term quiet quitting, but now we're hearing about quiet cracking. What exactly does that mean? What's the difference?
Thank you very much for having me this morning. So the key difference here is that essentially there's this awareness or not about whether one is quietly quitting or quietly cracking. And I'll start with that definition. So you spoke about this persistent workplace unhappiness that employees may have, which leads to them being disengaged from the workplace, may result in poor performance and an increased desire to quit their job. So that feeling of, I don't really want to be here anymore. I don't necessarily want to be giving my all, or I'm not giving my all, whether I'm aware of that or not. And really the consciousness, I think, of this impact happening under the radar versus what we knew as quiet quitting, which was essentially one showing some form of resistance because perhaps there's some dislike or unappreciation about the role, and a person sitting there and thinking, well, actually, I'm not going to give this my all.
But Leila, how do we then differentiate between whether I'm just having a bad week or perhaps a bad month? What are some of the early warning signs that an employee might be quietly cracking?
Yeah, so I think that's where the difficulty comes in, right? It's very difficult for employers to actually differentiate what the root cause is. And as attorneys, we see this often. What we get asked about is, I have this impact. I see that my employees aren't performing. I want to address a performance issue. So we're dealing with the consequence. What we're not necessarily looking at so deeply is, what is the root cause of that? And why are we seeing these issues or impacts within performance or with productivity? And ultimately what that requires is for employers to consider that, do an audit of what's happening with their employees, engage with them and understand what is the reason for this. And with quiet cracking, this decrease in potential productivity is something that manifests within the employee space. And understanding why that happens could potentially be, in the case of quiet cracking, things like employees not being certain about what their work outputs are. What are their goals? Employees not understanding or engaging properly with management to understand where their role is meant to go, where it fits in within the business and how they contribute. And tied in very closely with that is perhaps lack of appreciation or seeing, good outcomes and approvals coming from your employer, and feeling as if one perhaps is not being upskilled, not being trained. You're not part of that, unified goal of where the employer is going strategically. So naturally, you see yourself shifting back and thinking, do I belong here? Am I seeing myself here in the future? How much am I contributing? It's that satisfaction element that's very important.
Sure, but Leila, how common is this then here in South Africa? I mean, you've mentioned issues around stress, panic attacks, and perhaps feeling trapped. How widespread is this problem becoming here in South Africa?
Yeah, so we don't have significant South African data at the moment, but what we have seen in the international space is we've seen a survey that was recently released by Talent TLMS, which was a survey over 1,000 employees done in the US around March 2025. And they saw, and really this is where a lot of this dialogue comes from. But what they saw was that while employees, around 40% of them were feeling, on a day-to-day basis, they're really quite happy with their employment. Maybe there's some workplace unhappiness. And about 80% of them are feeling secure in their jobs. But that number about security of work in the future now decreases to around 60%. And there one has to think, well, what is the reason for that? And the manifestation of that we're seeing in decrease in productivity is really, really critical. And there I'll point to a global assessment that was done by Gallup in 2023, although it was 2 years ago. It identified that low productivity sees a US dollar 8.8 trillion loss, which amounts to about 9% of global GDP from just loss of productivity and loss of engagement.
Leila, just briefly and in conclusion, for people watching today who might be silently struggling with these issues, perhaps a word of advice on how to navigate this.
Sure. So I think there's a two-way street here. The first is from the employee's perspective themselves, speak up, communicate with your manager, communicate with someone who you feel comfortable with. But at the same time, it's important for employers to empower their managers and empower their teams that are responsible for employees to actually engage with them and to audit what is happening with my employees. And it's through this dialogue only that we can identify the real cause of things like poor performance or low productivity.
Sure. Leila, thank you very much for your time. I think it's a moment for all of us to sort of self-reflect and figure out where we are when it comes to the work that we are doing on a daily basis. We thank you for your time and your insights as well. That was Leila Moosa, Senior Associate in the Employment Practice at Clifford Decker Hofmeyr, talking to us about the concept of quiet cracking. But we are going to give you your